It is my great pleasure to present our first invited speaker, Professor Madeline Hron. Am I saying that? See?
You can't go wrong if you say that.
Hron. There you go. Professor Madeline Hron is an associate professor in the Department of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. She's the author of Translating Pain, Immigrant Suffering in Literature and Culture, as well as various articles related to human rights issues, African literature, migration, trauma, and violence in such journals such as Research in African Literature, Peace Review, Journal of Literature and Trauma Studies, Forum in Modern Languages, Forum in Modern Language Studies, Disability Studies, Quarterly French Literature Studies, and Slavonic and East European Review. Madeline is currently working on 2 book projects, one related to cultural representations of the African child, and another on literary and cinematic representations of Rwanda post-genocide. Today she's presenting a talk titled Screening Suffering, Translating Real Refugees in Image and Narrative. Please help me welcome Professor Hron.
On PowerPoint. So, all right, so I'm going to be talking about refugees. Refugees today, so kind of bringing a global perspective to issues related to migration. I'm just going to get some water because I have a little bit of a cold, just in case I don't want to cough away on you. So the word refugee conjures up a host of stereotypical images, be it camps of white tents, huddled masses on rickety boats, or starved children with pleading eyes and outstretched hands. In his magisterial documentary, Human Flow, just from last year, Ai Weiwei works hard to dismantle these stereotypes with sweeping aerial sequences filmed by drones, eccentric provocative shots, or immediate footage filmed on cell phones. However, some of Human Flow's most memorable scenes are the brief glimpses it offers of the refugee camp. It features 40 such camps, including the mateship roadside camp in Idomeni, Greece, the sterile camp in Mizip camp in Turkey, Kenya's massive Dadaab camp shrouded in trash and sand, or the merciless incineration of the transit camp in Calais, France. The film informs us that the average refugee is displaced for 26 years, and that only 1% of encamped refugees will be able to find asylum in Western countries. It concludes that becoming immune to refugee suffering is very, very dangerous. It's critical for us to maintain our humanity. Much like Human Flow, this talk will survey a wide variety of images and films associated with refugeedom to expose us to some of the generic patterns that may render viewers immune to refugee suffering, and to reveal some of the strategies that filmmakers deploy to help viewers understand refugees' humanity and grapple with their sufferings. I truly believe that narrative, and film in particular, play an important role in promoting empathy for refugees and in underscoring some of the hardships that they face. In this talk, I wish to highlight aspects I find particularly challenging, namely the dynamics of encampment, the condition of limbo, and the role of the refugee child. Now, my work on refugees stems from my previous book, Translating Pain, which explores how immigrants and refugees express the hardship of immigration in literature and in real life. And it also examines some of the ways the migrant experience is represented in culture so as to erase or gloss over these sufferings. My work not only draws on literary or social science studies, but also incorporates medical studies to discuss the sufferings of migrants, and has been very well received by the medical and psychological communities. My book is on many cross-cultural psychology or medical humanities courses, just as much as it in literature courses. I think that my humanities perspective, or our humanities perspective, especially close literary and cultural study analyses, enable practitioners in various fields to grasp nuances that otherwise they would not have even considered. For instance, my book emphasizes that concepts like pain, suffering, or trauma are often quite Western-centric in their presentation. My work on Rwanda, for instance, it's clear that many victims of genocide do not present classic PTSD symptoms such as intrusion, distanciation, and other symptoms associated with PTSD, but experience what Rwandans call ihahamuka, or literally being paralyzed by fear, or freezing one's mind, or behaving like a frozen statue. So the key idea in my book, both for literary scholars as well as for practitioners in other fields, is that pain is like a language and requires translation to be expressed to others. My research argues that several factors affect the translation of pain, notably language, cultural elements, genre, and the attitude of target audience. My examination of French North African texts, for example, reveals that the most effective way of communicating one's suffering is through the body, or corporeal somatic signs, because the body functions as a universal signifier of pain. By contrast, my examination of Haitian texts showcases the difficulties of conveying suffering with cultural signifiers. And here I'm analyzing Haitian voodoo, its allusions and stories and symbols in immigrant texts. Lastly, my work on Czech immigré it questions the possibilities of conveying pain through silence, ellipsis, understatement, and irony. Finally, undergirding all of these is genre. In the case of the immigrants, the genre of the immigrant success story, or the rags to riches American dream assimilation acculturation, which foregrounds the myth of success, or the specious belief that everyone can succeed if they only try hard enough. It's very difficult to avoid this linear story of progress, as it not only signals the immigrant's successful entry into the social order, but it also reflects the triumph of the host nation in successfully integrating sociocultural difference. Since writing Translating Pain, I've been increasingly interested in framing immigration in terms of human rights issues, given the development of my work, specifically on refugees, torture, post-genocide in Rwanda, to name a few. As far as refugees are concerned, I've worked with refugees from Rwanda, both in Canada and Belgium, and I've also worked in refugee camps in Liberia and visited camps in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. And what shocked me, or profoundly affected me, were the inhumane conditions of these camps, and that people cannot legally work, they cannot leave the camp. And particularly harrowing is the situation of many kids who live in the camps, who often don't go to school, and again, have never left the camp. So these are kids that if you invite them to the store across the road from the refugee camp to buy candy, they will ask you, please, can I buy some water instead? These 250 milliliter bags of water. These are kids who have never seen a tree. So I'm teaching about a book, and I realize they've never seen a tree because they can't even conceptualize anything larger than a bush because they've never left the camp, and of course any tree would have been cut down for firewood a long time ago. And what's most depressing about these camps is that they've existed for decades, and they're all these children have ever known. The Liberian and Rwandan camps, for example, have existed more than 20 years. At this point, I'm going to share some stats, which are probably familiar to all of you working in the field, but I feel obliged to share them every talk. So as the numbers show, the world is currently experiencing the highest levels of displacement since World War II. According to the latest stats, there are 65 million people who are refugees. Among them, 22 million are refugees living in camps. Of these refugees, 10 million, or half of them, are children. And then there are 10 million people who are stateless, meaning that they have no nationality and thus are deprived of basic rights and protections. In the West, statistically, there are much fewer immigrants than refugees. If you look at the chart, there were some 1 million new immigrants to the US, 250,000 to the UK and Canada, and 11,000 to Iceland, to take a very tiny country. Each of these countries accepted a fraction of refugees, the notable exception being Germany, which in the past 3 years has accepted 1.2 million refugees. And the US, proportionally, accepted the same number as tiny Iceland, which looks kind of ridiculous when you see it in Iceland's case, but probably is the same ridiculousness when in the case of the US. Aha, but this is of course only the Western-centric part of the story. The countries accepting the most refugees: Jordan with 2.7 million, Turkey 2.5 million, Pakistan with 1.6 million, Lebanon with 1.5 million, followed by Iran, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Chad. So, not exactly countries that should be accepting refugees for global stability. Again, these numbers are not fully representative. For instance, Pakistan has accepted close to 1 million refugees for the past 10-15 years. So this is not a new thing, new phenomenon for them. And of course, these numbers do not represent the number of undocumented immigrants, both in the US, but also in a place like Iran, where sure, they have 1 million official refugees, but they also have 700,000 undocumented Afghani, Iraqi, and Kurdish refugees coming in every year. So, now, refugees or displaced people have been around since the beginning of time, as Miguel mentioned, but their numbers have increased dramatically since World War II, or since the rise of the nation state in the 18th century, and then in World War II, when there were some 40 million displaced people. The UN created a new agency to protect them, the UNHCR, as well as defining what a refugee is, which, as you probably well know, is a person owing to a well-founded fear of persecution is unable or unwilling to return to the country of their nationality. The key difference, however, between refugees of the far past or refugees of the 1950s is the increasing violence against civilians in war. So since the Korean War, the main casualties of war have not been the opposing army, but civilians. And secondly, the increased use of the refugee camp as the de facto solution for political inertia concerning complex problems ranging from civil war to climate change. For instance, a constellation of camps from Lampedusa in Italy to Calais in France have become Europe's unofficial answer to the Mediterranean refugee crisis. Though camps are supposed to be temporary zones of safety or humanitarian sanctuaries, they've increasingly become associated with permanent solutions and with language of containment, threat, insecurity, militarization, and terrorism. Enhanced border control, immigrant detention, incarceration of undocumented migrants increasingly correlates refugees with criminality, so much so that scholars and activists refer to this nexus as crimmigration. And I'm more than happy to talk about that during question period. But what I'm interested here is the camp, which has become the synectical image of the refugee experience of persecution, marginalization, confinement, stasis, and victimhood. Encampment has been studied in various ways. Geography scholars such as Nick Gill describe camps as carceral spaces in line with prison, POW, and concentration camps to reveal the punitive and incarcerating praxis in which migration is managed. Anthropologists like Michel Agier have developed on Mary Douglas's notion of purity and danger to argue that camps represent, quote, a form of biosegregation, wherein the unwanted elements of society are confined to the margins, unquote. Conflating refugee camps with Nazi death camps, political theorist Giorgio Agamben has famously argued that the camp is, quote, a state of exception, unquote, existing outside ordinary law, wherein camp inmates are reduced to the epitome of bare life, quote, a life devoid of value, unquote. Some of these frameworks, especially Agamben's, the last one, have been criticized by refugee scholars for failing to provide useful analytical tools to grasp the social relations within the camp, and especially as devaluing tactics of resistance that camp inhabitants do adopt. The humanities, especially narrative and film, play an important role in conveying the lived experience of refugees in an immediate and engaging way. Camp life is defined by limbo, or protracted waiting. Theorists struggle to define this temporal suspension or liminal in-betweenness, just as film directors struggle to capture it cinematically. For instance, Agier terms it a state of liminal floating, an empty desert-like space, but concedes that durable life is not supposed to exist in a space outside of place, a moment outside of time, an identity without community. Refugee advocate Izzat Mosalanejad even compares the prolonged limbo of the asylum process to practices of torture. Mosalanejad, a torture survivor himself, explains that limbo is a powerful torture technique. It includes waiting for torture, being forgotten, being given false news, being part of mock executions. As Mosalanejad quotes here, the limbo of bureaucratic backlog relates to the limbo of torture, as it causes, quote, tremendous psychological tension, depression, and re-traumatization for thousands of refugees, especially those who are survivors of war and torture, unquote. Now, film audiences have only a passing experience of the torture of limbo, or of the paralysis, stasis, exclusion, or the, quote, frozen otherness, to quote Michel Agier there, of refugeedom, and frankly would rather avoid it. Limbo resists a fast action plot, progressive narrative development, or special effects, hallmarks in films and books today. So now let's consider how refugees have been represented in image and film. And here I think we can really discern some of the interstices of humanities research and public policies about refugees, because these images reflect public perceptions and understandings of refugees. But before beginning looking at these images, it's crucial to note that in comparison to immigrant narratives, there's clear lack of stories in films by refugees themselves. Most refugees are not writers or filmmakers. Those living in camps or seeking asylum don't have the time, means, or energy to compile their experiences or the desire to relive their traumatic pasts. Even if they wish to share their stories, they often lack the skills to capture their experiences engagingly enough to attract a publisher's or distributor's attention. More importantly, publishers, editors, scriptwriters don't want refugees to dwell on their suffering too much. With refugees then, the genre factor that I mentioned, the genre of the immigrant success story, is very difficult to avoid. Now, when considering images of refugees, these force us to interrogate, how do we depict refugee suffering visually? How to portray this suffering in a novel or authentic way? When refugees are represented, are they simply victims, or are they subjects with agency? What of culture? These are some questions to consider in my quick survey of refugees, from classical art to contemporary films. So I'm starting with classical art here because I find it fascinating that classical depictions of exile also reveal deep-seated preconceptions about the suffering of refugees today, namely about guilt and innocence, or just and unjust suffering. For instance, in renderings of Adam and Eve expelled from paradise, from Michelangelo to Chagall, it's clear that these refugees are guilty and that their exile is just punishment for their disobedience. We see avenging swords and angels. By contrast, Jesus' exile to Egypt was clearly undeserved, and most renditions of Flight to Egypt depict Jesus' exile as a leisurely journey, if not a sacred educational experience. For instance, Caravaggio and François Boucher's paintings depict Mary and Joseph reading fat library tomes under palm trees while being ministered by attentive angels. Now, such attendant notions of guilt and innocence do continue to linger in contemporary images about refugees. Migrants are trapped between stereotypes depicting them as threats to national security and those painting them as helpless victims in need of humanitarian aid. Moreover, as we shall see, the refugee journey is all too often structured as an educational journey, a Bildungsroman, wherein refugees from the developing world learn about the wonders of Western civilization. Now, in the 19th century, when wars between empires led to the emergence of nation-states and the splintering of minority groups, classical paintings start to reflect more contemporary imagery. Whereas earlier depictions of exile privileged the nuclear family journeying through strange landscapes, these images showcase groups of people displaced by war. They all feature familiar scenes, huddled masses dressed in rags and eyes as if averted as if in pain. Often, bright colors of items of clothing, such as a red waistcoat, lend some ethnic attribution to these displaced groups. Saliently, children frequently foreground in these paintings and stare accusingly at the viewer. During World War II, images of refugee become even more archetypal. Forms are simplified and starker, and the huddled mass mobs, bereft of ethnic association or individuality, are increasingly more undifferentiated and dehumanized. Rather, they're increasingly objectified, encumbered by their clothing or baggage, and blending into the backgrounds of buildings. By the late 20th century, as emblematized in magazine covers, refugees or illegal migrants are often reduced to caricatures, conflated with metaphors of floods, invasions, or contamination. Problematically, in the United States, they are often replaced by symbols of nationhood, such as the Statue of Liberty of the American flag, under threat. Here it's not the immigrant who is suffering, it's the nation who is the suffering victim. So there's this competing imagery about refugees as threatening illegals or as mobs of victims. By contrast to these facile, fear-inducing caricatures of migrants and security threats is the difficulty of showcasing refugees in a humanitarian manner. Here, for instance, prize-winning photographer Yanis Berkadis showcases some of the difficulties of representing these migrants as individual victims in an arresting way. Notably, Berkadis often employs the image of a child to gain our attention and sympathy. In film, images of refugees are inextricably linked with that of humanitarian media coverage started in Biafra in the 1970s. In this grisly civil war, the Nigerian government basically left Igbo women and children to starve in refugee camps. It was a watershed moment in media coverage. It was the first televised war, along with Vietnam, and because of the starvation that ensued, it was the first televised famine in history. Most importantly, Biafra heralded the basic visual vocabulary of humanitarian coverage that was repeated from Ethiopia to the 1980s to today. White tents, doctors as saviors, and most importantly, the sentimentalism associated with images of suffering children. So Biafra first showcased these skeletal African children with bloated stomachs, the Kashorkior, with hopes of eliciting pity and charity from the Western viewer. And such imagery has only become more exploitative since. 50 years after Biafra, it took the graphic photograph of a dead toddler, the corpse of Alan Kurdi, to inspire international concern over the Syrian refugee crisis. The digital revolution in the 1990s signaled yet another shift in the representation of refugees. Digital media made it much easier for professional and amateur filmmakers to create videos, just as the internet and YouTube made them much simpler to distribute. In Human Flow, some of the key footage was captured by Ai Weiwei on his cell phone, and throughout the film, despite their dire circumstances, refugees continue to communicate with loved ones via cell phones. Since the 1990s then, most films about refugees are documentaries, which privilege realism as a form of testimony. Filmmakers hope that by exposing viewers to refugees' harrowing real-life experiences, this will urge viewers to be sympathetic and intervene in refugees' plight. Film theorists generally agree that films about refugees oscillate between the polarities of sentimentalism and realism, and that both polarities can be problematic, if excessive. On one hand, the affective expectation, and here I'm referring to Berlant, that refugee stories be dystopic, tragic, or melancholic, reduces refugees to suffer objects of pity, whose only agency is inescapable victimhood, to quote film theorist Ipek Seplik. On the other hand, too much realism risks reducing refugee narratives to, quote, epistemologically verities, to cite literary theorist Agnes Woolley. Here, the viewer is placed in the position of judging the authenticity and legitimacy of refugee claims, and increasingly disallowing experiences such as those shaped by trauma, emotion, or memory lapses that do not fit generic patterns. My own contribution to refugee film scholarship has been to show that there are basically three genres of refugee film. Those focusing on acculturation to the host country or immigration films, those following migrants' journey to freedom or road movies, and finally the films that feature life in refugee camps. As you can see, there are many films about refugees, and there are many more that this slide cannot show. But most films about refugees conflate the refugee story with the immigrant narrative. Though we've only seen that only a very small percentage, 1% of refugees, actually do make it to the West. So these films focus on the rags to riches American dream assimilation narrative and largely naturalize and neutralize the suffering of refugees. As I mentioned before, the immigrant success story reflects the narrative of the successful host nation as economically thriving, socially classless, and proudly welcoming racial and ethnic and gender differences. Often foregrounded in these films is the civilizing mission of the immigrant Bildungsroman. For instance, in films about the Lost Boys of Sudan, their decades-long experience of encampment in Kakuma camp in Kenya is glossed over, and instances of culture shock are emphasized, such as the boys' first time eating McDonald's, encountering snow, or using a toothbrush. In such cases, the immigrant narrative of Bildungsroman serves a pernicious purpose: to educate or civilize non-Western others, and thus to reaffirm Western superiority. As Ray Chow has argued, it engenders, quote, an epistemological hierarchy, unquote, in which the foreign other is the pre-modern, quote, primitive, as opposed to civilized Westerner. Recently, a few films, in Europe especially, draw on humor to gently point to the xenophobia of certain conservative Westerners, and so to call into question Western values or criticize Western ways. Though commendable for this criticism, these comedies still continue to privilege the perspective of Westerners. Refugees in these films are often caricatured and their experience of refugeedom drolly simplified. Today, the most popular type of film about refugees is the road movie, to use a term from Terence Wright, which follows the arduous journeys refugees undertake from their broken homelands to promised lands in the West, and addresses the anxieties related to invading or illegal others, be it Hispanics to the US or Syrians into Europe. Here, for example, are some films focusing on the treacherous desert crossing to the US. These films, on the other hand, delve into the death-defying sea voyage across the Mediterranean. And there are more to come. There's films planned by Spielberg and Abrams. These films, which focus on survival films, disaster movies, or the gangster and Western genre, contain a lot of action, and basically represent the suffering migrants as that of man versus nature, or man versus technology. There are numerous scenes of forensic surveillance measures, to refer to visual anthropologist Stephen Cohen, as refugees are tracked by satellite or hunted by infrared technology. Unlike in a traditional road movie, there is little liberation or freedom for these migrants. On the contrary, they find themselves trapped or subsumed by the vehicles that transport them, creating what theorists such as Ballesteros and Bell have termed as claustrophobic emphasis or claustrophobic proximity. For instance, in a harrowing scene in Winterbottom's In This World, refugees smuggled in a ship container slowly suffocate to death, and viewers are forced to experience, albeit for a few minutes, these passengers screaming themselves to death in darkness. These claustrophobic scenes relate to the carceral conditions of encampment. Encampment is also similarly sometimes alluded to in immigrant films, such as in Hotel Problemski, where assignment claimants in Belgium are confined to a hotel awaiting their claims process. There are numerous scenes of limbo in this film, such as the repeated scenes of empty corridors or boardrooms. In comparison, there are very few films set in refugee camps and focusing on camp life itself. Noteworthy examples include documentaries about Darfur, as well as recent documentaries about Syrian refugees in Zatri camp in Jordan, as well as a few science fiction films that you might be more familiar with. As intimated above, film focuses on camps face a couple of dilemmas. One, granting viewers some form of engaging narrative, while also capturing the protracted limbo of camp life. Two, that of depicting refugees as subjects with agency, while also pointing to the dehumanization that encampment engenders. After Spring, directed by Ellen Martinez and Stephanie Ching, exemplifies this quandary. This film follows two refugee families transitioning to life in Zatri camp, as well as those of aid workers managing the camp, and thus oscillates between emotions ranging from despair, loss, and fear to optimism, resilience, and community building. With its mixed message, the film struggles to convey the hardships of living encamped in limbo. Occasionally, the camera will spotlight survivors' lingering trauma by zooming in on their physical manifestations again, such as the silent pauses or their shaking hands or trembling lips. Or it will slowly sweep across the barren desert or barbed wire fences. More often, the prolonged sad waiting is captured in stills of young children staring blankly or despondently into the future, thus forcing viewers to pause, to be immobile, and to endure, albeit for a minute, the bleak future of limbo that a refugee bears on a daily basis. It also draws on repetition, such as sequences of refugees constantly watching television newscasts or homemade videos to emphasize the repetitious monotony of refugee existence. Finally, the film showcases that there are few facilities for physically and mentally challenged refugees, and no treatment options for refugees suffering from depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and suggests that, as a result, domestic abuse, elder abuse, and sexual abuse are rife in the camps. However, After Spring also undercuts refugee suffering and sense of limbo with its narrative of progress and community building. Zatri is depicted as a model camp with containers instead of tents, electricity, a Twitter account, stalls selling delicious food, and opportunities such as taekwondo for camp children. While viewers such as my students observe refugees loading up grocery carts, preparing worth-wearing pizza, or repeatedly sitting around watching TV, their sympathy for refugees' plight might somewhat subside. However, these market scenes or the taekwondo training also emphasize the refugees' resilience, entrepreneurship, and potential. Instead of reifying in camp life as, quote, one of devoid of value or, quote, unworthy of being, and here I'm referring back to Agamben, After Spring reveals that many refugees enjoy campsmanship, and here I'm using a term by Nando Sigona, and live in a bustling anti-city of their own making, and here I'm quoting architect Alessandro Petti. Ai Weiwei's Human Flow draws on the contrasts between inside and outside the camp, or between mobility and stasis, to reveal the suffering of refugees, as well as their humanity, agency, and heroism. Human Flow represents the most comprehensive, big-budget documentary about refugees to date. Its 2,000-member crew traveled to 23 countries and 40 refugee camps, shot 900 hours of footage, and conducted 600 interviews to create this hour and 40-minute documentary. Its aesthetics are really stunning. Particularly impressive are the aerial sequences shot by drones, which conceptually illustrate the sheer scale of the refugee migration, but also emphasize the fragility of the human condition on a planetary scale. In one scene, and I wish I could actually show you the sequence, but the film is still in theater, so I can't really do that legally. All right, the camera hovers over ants scurrying over a mound of red earth, and as it zooms in, the drone reveals shots of children playing in a camp. Similarly, the film's closing shot zooms out on millions of life jackets. So you see like 2 life jackets, and then suddenly see all these life jackets. And this scene evokes the abandoned suitcases at concentration camps, and once again illustrates the sheer scale of the refugee crisis and the vulnerability of its victims. In contrast to Human Flow cinematography, which emphasizes refugees' freedom and mobility, is the stagnation and stasis of the numerous camps that Weiwei visits. In contrast to grandeur of million people on the move are the harrowing stories of survivors. For instance, in one camp scene, a woman turned away from the camera, facing a wall, sobbingly testifies that, "I cannot live like this." And then she completely breaks down and throws up, and the camera speeds up to show Weiwei comforting her, so this is the still that I got. Disturbed, the viewers are left unsure why exactly her situation is untenable. All that is clear is that she's encamped and profoundly in pain. Similarly, at the end of a film, a young girl living in Germany's Tempelhof airport camp sums up her encampment as, quote, "the most difficult time of my life," explaining that everything is forbidden and life is so very, very boring, unquote. Now, the young girl's experience is contrasted throughout the film with more lighthearted, sentimental shots of children playing or being silly. Despite this playfulness, however, the film also clarifies or makes it very clear that these children are receiving very little education and thus they are extremely susceptible to militarization. The human flow signals in no uncertain terms that the cycle of violence will continue for future generation of refugee children unless some radical change occurs as far as encampment itself is concerned. To conclude, I wish to take pause on the cinematic representation of the encamped child. Children figure in numerous refugee films, as you can see here, and they feature in even more humanitarian video campaigns. It's perhaps not surprising. After all, half the world's refugees are children, numbering more than 50 million in 2016. Narratively, the figure of an innocent child fleeing war invites explanation or redemptive storytelling. Visually, images of children help battle compassion fatigue and indifference. Callousness, jadedness, sarcasm are all inappropriate when children are involved. Children eschew questions of guilt or innocence. To cite Karen Lurie, they are, quote, perfect victims, blameless, who makes wrong seem more wrong, unquote. Finally, because of children's fragility and the brevity of childhood, children invoke a sense of urgency and emergency. Action must be taken immediately to save the children. In all, the power of children to enact social change cannot be underestimated. For instance, in 1972, the photograph of Kim Pak, a girl fleeing a napalm bombing who lives in my town, changed public opinion about the Vietnam War. Similarly, in 2015, the photo of Alan Kurdi, a toddler washed up on a beach in Greece, prompted international outcry over the Syrian refugee crisis. That being said, deploying children can serve to normalize the conditions of encampment. Some viewers watching children gambling among refugee containers may be misled into believing that refugee situation is not as dire as depicted. Moreover, utilizing children protagonists can eschew or simplify thorny political problems or moral complexities that are inherent in refugee politics. Lastly, it's all too easy to draw on children as tokens of pathos or miserablism, to reduce their plight to sentimentalist melodramas, or to infantilize children as naive half-beings without agency. So in a final aside, I'd like to point to a brilliant Iranian film, Turtles Can Fly, directed by Bahman Khobadi, which poignantly showcases encamped life from the perspective of children without ever sentimentalizing or infantilizing them. Set on the eve of the US invasion of Iraq, amongst military wreckage and abandoned weapons, this gritty neo-realist film explores the stark aftermath of war for Kurdish children living on the Turkish-Iraqi border. Khobadi even employed local camp children, so they're all local kids, adding a further degree of authenticity to the film. These children's main occupation in these border camps is demining landmines. As the film title implies, the children resemble turtles because they carry backpacks of diffused mines on their backs. If they faithfully set off a landmine, they will become turtles that fly. Indeed, some of the film's most harrowing scenes feature a young teen, Hengov, defusing landmines with his teeth because he no longer has any arms because of previous accidents. In another nail-biting scene, a blind toddler, Riga, climbs onto a landmine and forces others to save him with injurious consequences. Now, I don't want to give away the plot of the film, but if you need to know, I will tell you in question period. But suffice it to say that it revolves around a trio of Kurdish refugees who, according to the filmmaker, reflect Kurds' past, present, and future. As Fran Hasenshall explains, these children's lives reflect pooch or huzun, a type of sadness or pessimism about the future that is untranslatable into English, but that affects many war survivors. In a world with 50 million child refugees, there will be ever more children experiencing complex forms of trauma as a result of war, illiteracy, statelessness, and experience of encampment. Clearly, these children, like Alan Kurdi, deserve more. They deserve a normal childhood, a life outside the camp, a life defined by more than their status of refugees in limbo. To sum up, sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has famously argued that many aspects of refugeedom, such as limbo, are beyond representation. That refugees signal the untouchables, unthinkables, and unimaginables of contemporary globalization. He even says that they're the very embodiment of human waste with no useful function to play. Now, As someone who's worked with refugees in camps, I can't in any conscience consider refugees as human waste. Moreover, this survey of refugee images and films showcases that the refugee experience, even if in its opaque suffering, is by no means unthinkable. Sure, the suffering of refugees is the suffering of distant others. Sure, this representation is marred by stereotypes or by excess sentimentalism and realism. That being said, I do believe these films bring distant refugees closer to us and make their experiences of encampment real and imaginable. In so doing, it also brings the hardships of those others among us closer to us. Though I'm not an expert on U.S. immigration policies, I can clearly see links between distant refugees and the situations of young Americans called dreamers living in limbo. For me, the failure to deal with current refugee and immigrant issues doesn't stem from a lack of science or technology or social science data or economic or structural frameworks. It stems from a lack of understanding and imagination. It's basically a failure of imagination. Be it the failure to imagine the life of a refugee, or imagine the future of a refugee child, the limbo of a dreamer, or another solution to refugee issues other than that of encampment. Certainly, what I'm seeing in social media today is that xenophobes are constantly reiterating the same false, facile, pernicious, specious, and unimaginative stereotypes about the other, be it the distant other or the proximal one. This discourse needs to be interrupted, be it by an appeal to the truth, experience, or sentiment, or by inspiration or imagination, or by an appeal to empathy or basic humanity of what makes us human. This is what I believe is the role of a humanities scholar working on issues of immigration as an agent of change. Thank you.